On Saturday the 19th of March 2011, a coalition of Western powers led by America, Britain, France and Italy, and backed by the Arab League, launched airstrikes on Libya. The stated aim: to establish a no-fly zone to cripple Colonel Gaddafi's air force in response to a people in crisis. This programme examines the case for intervention in an historical context and asks what really motivates Western intervention.
The aim of this is to enforce the resolution which says we must act to protect civilian life. It is for the Libyan people to determine their own future, but we are giving them the space to do that by stopping them from being killed by a brutal dictator.
Gaddafi came to power following a military coup in 1969, deposing the Western-backed monarchy of King Idris. He nationalised Libya's oil industry and ordered British and US forces based in the country to leave. In 1977, Gaddafi announced that Libya would be run by a People's Committee, but he would maintain executive control. Civilian ministers were tasked with running the country, but were required to refer to the Revolutionary Command Council when making decisions regarding matters of state. Gaddafi's Green Book outlined his autocratic social and political programme. Throughout his time in power, Gaddafi has maintained an uneasy relationship with much of the West.
The whole world witnesses this official terrorism being practiced by America. And Libya cannot be patient forever to live under international terrorism.
His support for revolutionary groups such as the IRA and the PLO rendered him unpopular with many Western leaders. The bombing of US soldiers in a Berlin nightclub in 1986 led to America bombing Libya in retaliation. The US later paid reparations to Libya for the attacks. In 1988, a Boeing 747 was deliberately crashed into the Scottish town of Lockerbie, killing over 250 people. Following allegations that Libya was behind the bombing, Gaddafi became an international pariah. The ensuing sanctions were not lifted until 2003, when Gaddafi admitted responsibility for the attack. He also withdrew his intention to build weapons of mass destruction, gaining further concessions from the Western powers. For all Gaddafi's populist rhetoric, an explosion of protest inspired by revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt in 2011 exposed the oppressive nature of his regime.
What happened in Libya was a popular uprising very similar to the popular uprisings in Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and so on, all across the region. The difference was that it very quickly became quite regional, in the sense the first uprising was in the east of the country, and there was a crackdown of any kind of activists in the west of the country in Tripoli, but at the same time there was also quite significant demonstrations of support for Gaddafi in the west of the country. So in that sense it was different, and then the thing that was also different was that the army initially was completely loyal to Gaddafi and did what he told them to do, and then started to split away a bit, but not completely, in the east of the country with the attacks on civilians there. So it is different. It is also different because there's a degree of fighting that's gone on, and the way in which the opposition to Gaddafi has been very quick to resort to arms in a way that the oppositions in Egypt and Tunisia have not resorted to arms at all.
The West's relationship with Libya and the idiosyncratic Gaddafi has been complex.
Libya has gone from every conceivable political position and alliance that I can ever think of. I was a young man when Gaddafi became the leading figure in Libya. I don't really want to call him the president because he doesn't see himself in that way. He sees himself as leader of a green popular movement, green in the sense of the colour green popular movement. has presided over an urbanisation, a centralisation and an industrialisation of the country, set himself up as a very important leading figure in the Organisation of African Unity, formed alliances with all kinds of people all over the world, was accused variously of supporting the IRA, of supporting various what are quoted as terrorist or freedom-fighting organisations all around the world, was accused of developing weapons of mass destruction, clearly was presiding over what had become a very wealthy country and a very wealthy economy. Then the total change following the post-Iraq war, post-Afghan war situation, when he did deals with the West, particularly with Tony Blair, ended up having a very close relationship with Italy, very close relationship with British companies, and indeed was receiving military support from Britain until, February of this year.
In 2003, following the so-called deal in the desert, Tony Blair sold arms contracts to Gaddafi worth £350 million. But despite being brought in from the cold, Gaddafi remained a constant problem.
With Libya, you have Gaddafi, who's been there for 42 years, and he hasn't actually done much to his country. And yet, his country is a very wealthy country. And when you look at Libya today, it's not a very developed country, like the Emirates, for instance, who had half the money that actually Libya has generated for the last 40 years. And yet, where is the money? The money has been actually wasted in stupid projects like the man-made river, like supporting any rebellion, any revolutionary group worldwide. And that was the hallmark of Gaddafi in the 80s and the 90s. And only in recent years, in fact, that he has changed. But even though he has changed, he still is a maverick. He's still unpredictable in his approach. And also, he has been pressurizing a lot of African states. The African states actually want him to step down. They want him out of the way, because he has been an obstacle to African unity. He has been disuniting the African grouping, and they would like him to go. The Arab League would like him to go, because he has been very divisive. He's always been the black sheep of the Arab League, the black sheep of the African Union, and also the black sheep of the Mediterranean Union, because Libya is actually the only country who's not a member of the Mediterranean, the Union for the Mediterranean, where there are 47 countries. Libya is out of it. And why? Because Gaddafi has his own way of thinking, his own way of looking at things. And everybody looks at him as a maverick, somebody unpredictable, rather strange, bizarre. And this is how people actually qualify him worldwide.
There was a period where Gaddafi was an enemy of the West, and the Americans bombed Gaddafi and killed one of his children in the 1980s. But in the last decade, there has been a rapprochement between Gaddafi and the Western powers, particularly the British. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown both did a deal with Gaddafi where they would give him arms and he would give them oil and gas. So he was rehabilitated on this basis. Blair did this quite explicitly because he wanted to rectify some of his failings over Iraq, and he wanted to make it look like he was succeeding in the Middle East, and that was one reason he did it. It's interesting that until a few weeks ago, Gaddafi referred to Blair as a friend of the family. So yes, they have huge responsibility. They have been selling them arms, and not just them. David Cameron, when these revolutions were beginning, was going around the Middle East selling arms to dictators, and the only role most of these arms has is to repress the internal populations.
It was these weapons that had been used to suppress the Libyan people and push back the advancing revolution. Now the West was intervening to disable the very military infrastructure they had helped create in the first place. It was hailed as a humanitarian intervention to prevent the annihilation of a revolution in retreat.
And I don't think the international community would actually object to that when Gaddafi said that he was going to go from one house to another and weed out all the opponents or the dissenters or the rebels. And of course, you're going to have a bloodbath on your hand, and the international community is not going to allow that. And that is why everybody seemed to concur on the fact that they should intervene to stop a bloodbath in Libya.
Although many supported intervention on humanitarian grounds, some questioned this.
You never get a war which is purely even presented as a humanitarian issue. There are a whole number of regimes around the world which are repressing their own populations where the West doesn't even consider intervening or having anything to do with any opposition which grows in that country. They do so because they believe their interest will be helped by doing so. And there are clearly the resources of oil and gas, but there's also the strategic interest. I think they're very frightened that the Middle East may get out of their control. And part of the strategy, both with Libya and with Bahrain, is to try to halt these uprisings and stop them from going any further. I think it's very, very clearly an aim of the West in both countries for different reasons and in different ways. But this is effectively what they're saying is, please let's return to normality, to stability, to all these sorts of things, regardless of what benefit that is for the people of these countries.
It was to be the third war with a Muslim country in a decade. But were there parallels with the invasion of Iraq in 2003 or the occupation of Afghanistan?
MPs in the British Parliament, as we saw in the recent debate about Libya, are extremely nervous about any kind of foreign intervention anywhere because they're all scarred by the memory of Iraq. And the government has gone to enormous lengths to claim that this is a strictly limited intervention based on a no-fly zone.
The Iraq War had faced intense criticism for failing to secure UN backing. But the no-fly zone over Libya had been backed by UN Resolution 1973.
If you read the UN resolution carefully, it calls for diplomatic solution to the crisis, which was never sought. It calls for a no-fly zone. It also calls for weekly reporting initially on what's gone on, and it calls for a committee of experts to look at the future. But it also is rather vague on what other forms of intervention could take place and what other targets there actually are. And the rather curious alliance of countries that have taken part in the bombing seem to be taking part in bombing anything they feel like bombing. And so I think there are differences in the sense that the presentation by the governments is to their own audiences of a very strictly limited specific time frame of taking out Libyan air defences, but in the air and on the ground it's beginning to look a bit different.
The intervention was backed by international consensus, though this was nothing new.
Well, I think firstly we should remember that we've seen this sort of support for wars before. It's true that Iraq didn't get the second UN resolution, but it is true that Afghanistan 10 years ago did get almost universal support for a war led by the Americans.
Many critics called the Iraq War cynical and opportunistic, but in Libya, intervention had been called for by the revolutionaries themselves. With Gaddafi isolated internationally, and the threat of a possible massacre, was intervention a valid solution?
Generally speaking, I think these interventions add a new dimension in terms of the problems they make rather than become a solution to a problem. They appear to be for a good cause, for a humanitarian cause. In fact, instinctively, people would want to support such a humanitarian mission. But ultimately, the goal is not humanitarian because we know full well that these big powers are much more concerned about the economic and strategic interests of their own states rather than the genuine human rights, democratic rights of the peoples of the Middle East in particular.
However, not all commentators took such a view.
The primary motivation has been humanitarian, because had it been for oil, I think they would have gone from day one. But because because of the humanitarian problem, then people had to look at it from that point of view.
Some saw intervention as beneficial to Western interests.
The cries for help are understandable, but the decision to invite the missiles to rain on Libya, the bombardment of the Libyan infrastructure and so on, it might even add further complication in terms of civil strife in future, because, as I said earlier, these powers are much more concerned about their economic and strategic interests than the well-being of the Libyan people. And this is the bottom line. It's a very rich oil-producing country, so close to Europe. Libyan oil can be transported so easily across to Europe and so on. So there are many, many reasons why they felt that Libya has to be controlled. They probably did not have any control over the revolutionaries themselves.
The military alliance known as the Coalition of the Willing was described as broad and unified, but it was the smallest coalition since the end of the Cold War, and some disputed its stability.
We should also remember what happened at the UN, that a number of countries, very important countries, including China, Russia, India, Germany, which of course is part of the EU, and Brazil, all abstained on the vote. Now, they didn't vote against, they didn't veto it, which some of them have the ability to do. But that does show they're very, very worried about it, and they have already begun to criticise it. So I don't think it's got this kind of universal support. And of course, I can understand why people in Libya have been saying that they would want outside support because they want to defeat Gaddafi. But it does seem to me that very quickly they are going to see that this isn't the sort of support which is going to help them at all.
The intervention was also backed by the Arab League.
The Arab League calls on the Security Council to take the necessary steps to impose a no-fly zone on Libyan territories to ensure the safety of Libyans and those killed from other Arab countries.
I think the Arab League has played not a particularly good role in all of this. It backed the no-fly zone. Then it said, oh, well, we didn't really realise what this would mean and we don't like people being killed. Well, they shouldn't have backed it in the first place, which would have made it virtually impossible for the European powers and for America to go ahead. I think the problem with the Arab regimes, with both the Arab League and with the Gulf states, is that there's a huge amount of hypocrisy and double standards going on here, which is that Saudi has now gone into Bahrain at the invitation of the Bahraini government expressly to repress the uprising, the revolution which is going on there. There is massive repression in Yemen. There is repression right around the region. We know this, and yet we have these dictators, like the government of Qatar, saying we're going to bomb Libya for democracy, while at the same time they're denying their own populations the right to democracy.
I think the Arab League was trounced into making that decision. And remember, the Arab rulers in general, generally speaking, are themselves fearful of the consequences for their own futures. So to be backing the United States and its allies, they think that they will have some sort of support from these powers themselves in future. So it's a quid pro quo sort of scenario.
Libya, flanked by Egypt to the east and Tunisia to the west, has now become central to the revolutionary movement gripping North Africa and the Middle East. Whoever gains influence there could gain influence over the entire region and over the course of the revolutions. Beneath the surface of a humanitarian intervention, some believed more strategic factors were involved.
If you look at Western interventions in the whole region, you've got to go back, way back, 18th, 19th century, the endless meddling in Egypt, in Sudan, in Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and all across Saudi Arabia and all over the Gulf states. Particularly British interference. And the British Empire was a very curious thing because it wasn't always just about land. It was about trade, it was about naval access, it was about the Suez Canal, but it was also about having pliant monarchies in places in different countries.
In the UK's House of Commons, references were made to Western intervention in Kosovo. In 1999, Slobodan Milosevic's forces mounted a brutal crackdown on Kosovan Albanians in the breakaway province of Kosovo. In response, NATO launched 78 days of airstrikes until Milosevic withdrew his forces. It is widely considered to have been a successful intervention.
Well, if Kosovo is cited as an example of a very positive intervention, then I take issue with even that, because the Srebrenica massacre occurred while the intervention had already been in full swing, and the massacre occurred when the Dutch forces were already there and so on. So much of the killing was already either after the intervention or much later on. The civil conflict increased rather than decreased.
But with the Western coalition divided over the question of removing Gaddafi, what does the future hold for Libya?
I suspect it may well end up either in the partition of Libya, with a French-dominated east and a pariah state in the west, and it might well be seen as an end to other countries. Then is the West going to stay in Libya to support that government? Is the West going to be prepared to take part in setting up oppressing operations in order to sustain that government? I'm not so sure, because that will mean the whole Western image with all the other Arab revolutions is severely damaged. It's Britain and France that are most strongly behind it, and other European countries have come in a very odd sort of way with one or two planes. A lot of questions are there, and I suspect that the West is going to rather regret getting involved militarily on its own in this.
And what does the Libyan revolution and the uprisings across Africa and the Middle East mean for the future of Western relations?
Future is certainly the West is going to change its approach, it's going to change its policy towards North Africa and the Middle East, and certainly it's going to change in the way it deals with these countries and it deals with these people. And one important aspect of this is that the dealing is going to be from a different angle. Before it used to be with dictators and so on. Today and tomorrow it's not going to be with democrats, with people who are going to respond to the aspirations of their people.
If the West plays a decisive role militarily in ousting Gaddafi, the West will have very, very big influence in the country, and people shouldn't have any illusions about this. They will do, and therefore the whole question of the way in which it goes is very, very important. But the idea that Cameron is saying that he only has the interests of the Libyans at heart, this simply is not credible. It's not credible from a country which has intervened for 200 years in Africa and which has played a pretty bad role most of the time.
But the course of independence for the region is yet to be determined.
Libya,